This is one of the worst football games I've ever played. Joe Montana Football on the Sega CD is simply horrendous. The frame rate is atrociously bad, the 3D perspective is ridiculous, and the controls are simply awful. And even the playbook is mostly empty and really poorly put together. There is nothing redeemable about this game. Now, you have to remember that this was Sega's own game. This is a game that Sega published for Sega's new CD system. This was supposed to be like the special football game that got everybody really excited. Think about that for a minute. So Sega came out with its impressive Sega CD system. It was covering the airwaves with those commercials, talking about how it was so much better than Nintendo. And this was the flagship football game. It's insane. Now, the first Joe Montana game on the Genesis was a classic. If this looks like an early Madden game to you, there's a good reason for that. Sega hyped up its first Joe Montana game before Sega had a game, and it had to scramble when it didn't have a game in time. And so Sega kindly asked EA to make the game for them. And it's kind of ironic, actually. So that Joe Montana game was supposed to be the first football game for the Sega Genesis, Sega's new console, way back in, 1989, 1990. The game itself was actually good, but it was only that way because EA saved Sega's butt. So the story behind that one is that Sega had a contractor that was working on the game, but they weren't actually working on it. And so at the last moment, they had to go contact EA and say, hey, could you help put this game together for us so we're not totally embarrassed? Now, sadly, when it came time for the Sega CD game to come out, EA apparently wasn't quite as generous. Okay, if you were really into video games back in late 1991, you would have known all about the Sega CD. This brief reference to the new system came in the October 1991 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. EGM used a lot of ink to hype up the system that fall, and the focus of this hype was clearly on the CD-ROM technology. Now, the thing is, the CD-ROM technology was still pretty new back in 1991 and 1992. In fact, CDs in general were still pretty new. For example, my parents got their first CD player sometime around 91 or so, maybe it was 1990, it was right around then. Now, CD-ROM technology had technically been around for a few years by that time, but for the vast majority of consumers, this was still really new stuff. CD-ROM stuff was really expensive in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and its use was generally restricted to so-called multimedia. So, for example, this advertisement in PC World is for a bunch of computer programming packages, and just one of these packages would have cost more than the entire Sega CD did when it was new. It's not really until fall 1991 that you started seeing newspaper articles about CD-ROM software and hardware, and even then, the stuff was generally far too expensive for the average user. And so Sega's announcement of a new CD-based system really was a major deal. But as many of you already know, Sega really dropped the ball. So instead of making a dedicated CD system, which in hindsight would have been the best thing to do, Sega of Japan decided to follow the example of Hudson Soft, as in the TurboGrafx CD, and turn its CD-ROM into a console expansion. So this was kind of similar to the thought behind the old Famicom disk system. Sega's problem, though, is that the new Sega CD wound up just not really having very many good games, or very many games at all. Most of the early Sega CD games used the extra CD storage space to store video files. Night Trap was notorious for this and, of course, the shower scene, but the game itself is pretty bad. Prize Fighter was another early Sega CD game, and it's really more a piece of black and white cinema than an actual video game. The controls are clumsy, and you're basically trying to push the right button at the right time. It's kind of hard to believe that we once thought that this approach was next generation. Now, in theory, the Sega CD should have been capable of doing all sorts of really impressive graphical feats and stuff like that. However, the reality is that the Sega CD relied on the Genesis hardware to get the video signal out. So basically, it ended up being sort of like a memory expansion port for the Sega Genesis that happened to put its data on CD-ROM. Now, that's the reason why all of these games have a whole bunch of full motion video. It's because the Sega CD, even though it had a nice processor, couldn't do a whole lot to help you out with your video signal, right? The only benefit that the system offered was the ability to decompress and play like video files and put them through the relatively bad graphic system of the Sega Genesis. The thing is that the technology just wasn't there yet. So look at a game like NBA Jam on the Sega CD. It sounds good, sure, but it doesn't look all that great. In fact, it looks almost exactly the same as NBA Jam on the Sega Genesis. You can say the same thing about Bill Walsh College Football. The Sega CD version has better sound, of course. The graphics are the same as the original Genesis version, however. But EA also stuck in a bunch of video of Bill Walsh talking about stuff.
You can almost segment the country geographically.
Now, what you've got to remember is that early CD-ROM products were basically things like this. So the idea was to use the technology to store like an encyclopedia worth of information, stuff that you could then access on demand. Now, the fact that CD-ROM drives could only get, 1x speed at that time didn't really matter because you were like looking up a book, right? It was still faster than going to the library and finding the book on the shelf. Remember that nobody was really making 3D anything back in 1991. And so if your family could afford a CD-ROM system way back then, you probably had, things like this Compton's Family Encyclopedia with World Atlas. Or maybe if your dad was a programmer, you had the Microsoft Programmers Library. And you could find some CD-ROM games like this Lost Treasure of Infocom package, but CD-ROM level storage was probably overkill for games like these. It's not really until you get to around Windows 95 and that era that you start seeing PC games really take advantage of the CD-ROM technology. And I know there were some games that came out before then, but if you look at it honestly, you'll realize that it took a couple of years for people to really catch on to what it could do. Of course, Windows 95 also coincides with the release of the PlayStation, which completely changed the console video game market. So before 1995 or so, most of us played PC games that we installed on our hard drive straight from floppy disks, and most of our console video games came from ROM chips. And so it kind of makes sense that the Sega CD mostly just used the CD-ROM as like an additional massive storage unit. However, that is not a very good excuse for the monstrosity that is Joe Montana's Sega CD. The first thing you'll notice when you fire this baby up is that there are basically no options. You can only make a couple of basic decisions before you jump straight into the game. Now, the Genesis version of Joe Montana 93 isn't perfect, but at least it's got an easier to use menu system with more obvious options. Now, your first problem is figuring out how to kick off. The thing here on the top left is actually your kick meter, even though it doesn't look like it. The way it's supposed to work is that you're supposed to push the A button once, wait for the kick meter to go all the way to the end, and then hit A again. However, the video is so jerky that it would be a miracle if you could time the kick at all. And even when you manage to hit the meter perfectly, you still don't kick the ball out of the end zone. As you can see from those clips, the biggest problem with this game is not the kicking meter, it's not really the controls, no, it's the video. And I've got no idea how in the world a game with like 10 frames per second got through quality control. Now, running offensive plays in this game is really confusing, even basic running plays like this one. It turns out that you're supposed to push the A button twice on running plays, once to snap the ball and another time to hand the ball off. Now, if you look at, like a normal football game like Madden 93, you'll notice that the game hands the ball off automatically for you. You don't need to push the button over and over again just to give the ball to the running back.
You'll feel that one
The same is true of Joe Montana 93 on the Genesis.
Pitch out, the pitch to the back. Boom! Brought down, no gain.
This game is easy to figure out. Everything happens just the way you expect it to happen.
Tackled immediately. Brings up second down for San Francisco.
Meanwhile, in the Sega CD version, it feels like the ball teleports to your running back. Then again, you can always just forget about the stupid running back and let Steve Young run for a touchdown by himself. And it's not necessarily awful to require the player to push, another button to hand the ball off. I mean, the game would be okay if it wasn't for just that horrible frame rate, except that the passing system's completely broken, and I don't even know where to start with this one. The camera pans out to the side when you're going to pass for some strange reason, and of course that means that you're more likely to fumble. For some reason, this game has you choose your intended receiver before the play is called. You can do this using the B button. The reason the camera pans to the side is so you can see that receiver right when the ball is snapped, but of course the screen is really messy, which means you can't see what's going on anyway. Now, if you go back and look at that play in slow motion, you will notice that my receiver stopped as soon as I threw the ball. This is because the game has you take control of the receiver as soon as the ball is thrown, and he stops and does nothing until you push the D-pad to control him. The funny thing, of course, is that the manual doesn't tell you any of this. Anyway, I learned quickly that passing plays lead to turnovers every single time. You want to stick with running plays instead. Now, the nice thing about this game, the only nice thing about this game, is that you don't have those stupid passing windows. That's one of those things that just totally killed the earlier Sega football games. The problem with the passing windows is that guys will look open at first, but then they'll be covered as soon as you throw the ball. In fact, the passing windows are seriously the biggest flaw with the original Madden games.
That one didn't have a chance.
Joe Montana 93 has a much better passing system, though I still have my passes intercepted all the time.
Montana back to throw. He throws, intercepted at the 41. To the 40, brought down at the 34-yard line. Minnesota takes possession.
Of course, Tecmo Super Bowl on the Genesis had the best passing system of all of these games, and also the smoothest gameplay. And this is the reason why I keep bringing up the Genesis version of Tecmo Super Bowl as one of the best football games on the Sega Genesis. It really is a shame that it doesn't get more love, because it really is a good game. Meanwhile, the passing system in Joe Montana CD is just simply awful. I mean, if you play this game, don't pass. Run on every single down on offense. Passing is not worth the hassle. But at least you can play defense. Defense in this game is ridiculously easy, especially against the computer. The things that frustrate you on offense also frustrates the computer on offense, and you'll find that you score most of your points on defense. I don't even have a good suggestion for defensive strategy. Just about anything will work. It also helps that the AI does ridiculous things like this double handoff or whatever that was supposed to be. I don't even know. Anyway, that's really all that there is to this game. There aren't any, extra features or impressive things or anything like that. It's just a poorly designed and really buggy game that you likely won't ever want to play again. It got to the point for me where I just waited out the play clock for the entire second half in hopes of getting the game to just end. Even then, I couldn't help myself from scoring yet another touchdown. In my one and only exhibition game, I had over 100 yards despite negative passing yards, and I was able to hold the computer to -1 total yards over the course of the entire ballgame. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous, not even close to realistic, and really not even fun to play. And reviewers at that time knew that this was a bad game. Well, they sort of knew that this was a bad game. GamePro gave this game a scathing review, calling the graphics dull and lifeless. Now, GamePro used a 5-point scale, and 2.5 should have probably been average, but here 2.5 was like getting an F. But then most of the other reviewers were British or European magazines, and they gave the game great reviews. I mean, an 82 grade seems a little bit generous for a game that is literally unplayable. And I also came across this weird rumor that the game was recalled, though I have not seen any evidence of that at all. This rumor comes from the January 1996 issue of Ultimate Gamer, which is honestly a magazine I've never heard of. Somebody wrote in to complain about Sega, and in particular the $300 or so that they paid for Montana CD after it had been hyped for months in Sega publications. Their only response to the letter that they sent out was a form letter in return. Anyway, the magazine claimed then that Sega had recalled the game because of its many glitches. But seriously, that can't be true when you think about it. So if this game were actually recalled, you would expect it to be at least sort of rare, and it's not. In fact, this is one of the most common Sega CD games out there. And that's because it sold a whole ton of copies based on its hype alone. Well, even though this game came out over 30 years ago, you can still find complete in-box copies today for basically nothing. Sure, maybe it will cost you more money if you buy into the fraud that is WATA sealed gaming grading, but why would you spend this kind of money on a fundamentally broken game? Sealed copies are a bit more expensive than loose ones, sure, but this is actually less than the original retail price of the game. Anyway, that would not be true if this game actually had been recalled. I also have not been able to find any contemporary evidence of a recall at all. The game sold in stores for like a few months, and presumably it just stopped selling once people realized how bad it sucked, you know. In fact, the majority of the US gaming magazines did not even bother to review the game. In fact, I couldn't find anything outside of GamePro, and I really feel sorry for whatever journalist at GamePro had to actually sit down and play this game to write the review. I hope that they got like hardship pay for that. Anyway, this game is just bad. Seriously, this game is not even fun, it just sucks. Whatever you do, don't play this game. Play something fun instead. Anyway, more than anything else, this game is proof positive that Sega's quality control in the mid-1990s was non-existent. The company put out all sorts of slop and nobody cared.